All right, we are about a minute out, and just a heads up, commissioners, you will need to remain on screen for the actual meeting time, just to allow us to maintain quorum. Um, Camille, if you could resend the Zoom link to Commissioner Kim, he is currently looking for it. Um, and hopefully he'll be able to jump in shortly, but let's see. Message. Okay. All right. Thank you, team. And we can probably go ahead and go live and just get this started. I want to be mindful of time. So if we could let the open it up to the public and start broadcasting, that would be great. All right. Can someone from the team let me know if we're live?
Yes,
Yes.
we are.
Thank you. Commissioner Hedrick, please take it away.
Yeah, good evening. The California Racial Equity Commission Implementation and Technical Assistance Committee meeting is called to order at 4:31 on Tuesday, November 21st. Please note that per Robert's Rules of Order, I will be facilitating this meeting until agenda item number 3 and a committee lead is selected. Ayukui and good evening to everyone joining us, including commissioners on screen. Okay, as we begin today's virtual meetings, we do want to note a couple of items. First, as we continue to engage guest speakers, presenters, and the public, we want to name that the information and opinions expressed by presenters or public commenters before the commission reflect the view of the speaker. They do not necessarily represent the views of the commission or the governor's office of land use and climate innovation. Second, as a reminder, as a public body, public comment is critical to the work of the commission, and we will allow public input at all meetings. However, we stand united with other Californians in condemning hate and recognizing the harms that hate causes. A hate act is a hostile expression or action committed in whole or in part because of a person's actual or perceived identity or identities or characteristics, including race, color, disability, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender, including gender identity, and/or because the person is a part of a protected group. The rich diversity among our population in California is one of our state's greatest assets, and we're committed to supporting and protecting all people in California. As a reminder, if you're a victim or a witness to hate, racism, or bullying, you can report the incident and receive free support through the California versus Hate resource line. The hotline will help identify next steps and help connect you to resources, including legal, financial, mental health, and mediation services. Report hate by calling 833-8-NO-HATE or visiting cavshate.org, California versus hate.org. Before we move any further in this, I wanted to just do a little bit of a land acknowledgement. First, it's Native American Heritage Month, so hopefully you've had an opportunity at some point in this month to celebrate that. Second, I want to acknowledge that land acknowledgements are also a nod to cultural practices of Indigenous peoples here in California, but also across the globe. It's an opportunity to acknowledge when you're a visitor on someone else's homeland, to ask to be welcomed, um, and to sort of set that tone. So I want to begin by acknowledging that all of California is Indian country, all of California is Indigenous lands. And while we're today in a virtual platform, I'd like to invite you to take a moment to do that, your own research to determine whose land you might be a visitor on today. But for the purposes of this meeting, I want to note that the public was invited to a physical space, to an office in Sacramento, and that I am also Zooming in from Sacramento. The history of the Sacramento area and the people is rich in heritage, culture, and tradition. This area was and still is the tribal land of the Nisenan people. Sacramento was a gathering place for many local tribes who live throughout the Central Valley and the foothills, for who have lived throughout the Central Valley and the foothills for generations and were the original and continue to be the stewards of this land. We would like to acknowledge the Southern Maidu people to the north, the Valley and Plains Miwok peoples to the south of the American River, and the Patwin Wintun peoples to the west of the Sacramento River. We'd also like to honor the Wilton Rancheria, the only federally recognized tribe in Sacramento County. We acknowledge that we are standing on the tribal lands of Sacramento's indigenous peoples. Thank you. So just taking a moment to review the agenda, our agenda for this meeting covers 7 agenda items. We have hard copies of the agenda available at the physical space at 1400 10th Street, room 202, Sacramento, California. And materials are also available online at racialequity.opr.ca.gov. Dr. Estes, can you please provide a brief overview of the agenda for this meeting?
Yes, and thank you, Commissioner Hedrick, for providing that welcome and call to order. After this review of the agenda, we will do a roll call to establish that all committee members are here. We will then go into the selection of a committee lead and provide an overview of the committee and discuss the charge. We have built in here a 15-minute recess for the commissioners as well as the staff to take a break if necessary. We'll then move into a fireside chat focusing on moving beyond theory to really implementation of racial equity strategies to really start grounding the conversations to be had by this committee moving forward. I do want to acknowledge that in the printed agenda, we're having a second panelist, but unfortunately, Vivila Blossoming Bear is unable to join us this evening, and so we will just be having Dr. Rashad Abdur Rahman in our conversation today. And then finally, we'll receive direction from the commission on next steps. We will be sure to accept public comment after every agenda item to make sure that we are gathering information as appropriate and can move this work forward. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Dr. Estes. Okay, I'm going to ask for the support of Augustine Aurelia, who will lead the roll call to establish a quorum and provide an overview of the public comment process.
Thank you, Commissioner Hedrick. I'll begin roll call with Commissioner Angelica Salas.
Present.
Commissioner John Kim.
Present.
Commissioner Jolie Onodera.
Present.
Commissioner Virginia Hedrick.
Present.
Thank you. We have achieved quorum. For today's meeting, the committee is following the special teleconference rules for advisory bodies outlined under Government Code 11123.5, which allows members to participate remotely. Under these rules, the committee may vote on proposed actions to bring to the full commission. Moving on to public comment. Thank you, Commissioner Hedrick, for the introduction. I'm here to provide some information to help guide us all through the processes for this meeting, which we have designed with the intention of maximizing access by members of the public. For those joining the webinar online via Zoom or by phone, please note that your microphone is automatically muted when you join. In order to minimize the risk of background noise, you will not be able to unmute your phone yourself. For those joining online via Zoom, please note that the webinar platform doesn't enable video for attendees, so we will not be able to see you. If you need technical assistance during the meeting or have a question about the meeting process, there are a few ways to contact us. If you are using the online Zoom webinar platform, the best way is by using the Q&A function with several members of the Racial Equity Commission team monitoring it. If you joined by phone and you have access to email, please email racialequitycommission@opr.ca.gov. If you plan to make public comment virtually, you must be joining the meeting via Zoom. You can visit racialequity.opr.ca.gov/meetings and complete the public comment form linked there. You'll need to complete a separate form for each item on which you wish to speak. You may complete a form at any time during the meeting. When Commissioner Hedrick opens the public comment period for your item, he will call on your name. When you hear your name in that list, please raise your hand. To do this online in the Zoom webinar, you can click Raise Hand under the Participants menu. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. To raise your hand by phone, press *9. When it is your turn to speak, a member of our team will unmute your microphone. If you are online, you will see a window pop up alerting you that the host is unmuting you. You will need to click the option to approve unmute. After that, you can begin to speak. If you are on the phone, you will hear a recorded message alerting you that your line is unmuted. You can begin to speak after that. Each speaker will have a maximum of 2 minutes to make their remarks. If you're online, you'll see a timer pop up on your screen. Please monitor that and wrap up your remarks accordingly. When you are online or on the phone, Commissioner Hedrick or staff will notify you when your time is up. After that, we will mute your microphone. You do not need to take any further action. If you are unable to complete the online form but would like to make a public comment, please email racialequitymmission@opr.ca.gov. Thank you. Back to you, Commissioner Hedrick.
Thank you, Augustine. We will now take any public comments related to agenda item number 1, the welcome. Augustine, is there anyone?
There are currently no public comment for this item.
Okay, we'll give it another 30 seconds or minute or so. I'm not actually time tracking this, so. Any comments come in, any requests?
As of right now, no additional requests. Public comments have been submitted.
Okay, thank you. We'll continue to move forward. And please note to the public, there will be an opportunity for public comment at each agenda item. Today is the first meeting of the Implementation and Technical Assistance Committee. Before we move forward with our agenda, we will take any public comments for items not on the agenda.
There are no public comment for item number 2.
Okay, we will move into agenda item number 3, selection of committee lead and committee overview. As an order of business, we will now select a committee lead. The Implementation and Technical Assistance Committee will be responsible for presiding over Implementation and Technical Assistance Committee meetings and will work closely with Commission staff to develop meeting agendas that advance the work of the committee. Since there is no lead at this time, I will facilitate the nominations and voting process for the committee lead. We will be conducting a roll call vote to facilitate a recommendation to the full commission for election to the office. Do we have any committee members interested in nominating themselves or another commissioner for this role? Anyone? I could do this like an auction, going once. Dr. Estes, did we receive any interest prior to the meeting?
We did not receive interest prior to the meeting, and so just being mindful of those who may already be leads on committees. This is really to help the staff set the agenda. figure out kind of what are those next steps that we need to take to ensure that we are developing out this area in relation to the framework. And so it's an opportunity to work very closely with staff on this. And I just say to commissioners, you won't be alone in this process.
Um, Can I nominate John Kim?
John is laughing, but yes, you can.
I would second that.
Heard that.
I would also like to nominate Jolie, Commissioner Owender.
Okay, we have two nominations. Commissioners Onandera or Kim.
And we may need guidance from our attorney, Shannon Clark, as to how we could manage two candidates for this role in a very small group.
Would it help if I supported Commissioner Solis's recommendation for Commissioner Kim?
Yes.
Yes, I'm just trying to.
But I do want to be mindful of Commissioner Kim and
Oh, absolutely.
respectful of that. So, I mean, there is an option to potentially explore co-leads. That's something else we could even do, but we haven't really talked about that as an option either.
So I think the commission has some options here. We could, first of all, we could provide the nominated commissioners for chair an opportunity to maybe offer some comments if they would so choose. Following that, we could try and just take an initial vote and see if the committee is able to choose someone off the bat. And then if there is a tie, then we could go to subsequent votes. That's one option that we could move forward with here.
Yeah, I think first I want to know to the commissioners who have been nominated if they accept the nomination. It's my understanding commissioners have the opportunity to decline a nomination. So Commissioner Kim, do you accept your nomination?
I was wondering if I was going to have a chance to accept or decline, so I appreciate that, Commissioner Hendricks. I do not think I could take this on right now. So just to be very clear, I will do it if there's nobody else able to do it, but I don't think I could affirmatively take it on.
Commissioner Onandera.
I think I feel similarly to Commissioner Kim, so that I think if there's a possibility maybe to co-lead, unless we have another commissioner who would be, willing to take it on fully, and I'd be happy to nominate you, Commissioner Hedrick, or Commissioner Solis. Honestly, I just.
Thank you. I'm currently chairing the community engagement committee and with my colleague, also Virginia Hedrick. So maybe we go back to you, Virginia.
Yeah, thank you. I know we're all very busy. So I know that's on the desks of everyone. But I do support the nominations, both that are on the table. I'm not sure. Do you guys want to Rochambeau?
Well, would you be interested, Commissioner Hedrick, in serving as chair for this?
I am not interested, but I think, yeah, I'm not interested at this time.
Okay. Okay, so we don't have Onandera, Kim, or Hedrick. So I will.
No, it's fine. I think as opposed to having two co-chairs, I think we should just have one, and I'll go ahead and do it then. I don't know if that works. I will accept. I guess what I should say is I will accept the nomination.
Thank you,
I don't
Joe.
want you, to have to, Commissioner Salas, carry two.
Yeah, and I would just say also, just my own experiences that are incredible. Dr. Estes and others are very supportive in moving the work forward. And so, I mean, and actually supporting us, making sure that we meet our obligations. So, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Kim. It sounds like we do have an affirmation of nomination. So I think we can at this point call for a roll call vote. Augustine, can you help us with that vote?
Can we get a motion and a second first?
Sure.
I move that Commissioner John Kim serve as the committee lead for our implementation technical assistance committee.
Happy to second that motion.
Roll call will begin with Commissioner Hedrick.
Aye.
Thank you. Commissioner Salas,
Aye.
Commissioner Onodera,
Aye.
and lastly, Commissioner Kim.
I'll abstain.
Commissioner John Kim is voted in favor unanimously, bringing the recommendation to the full commission to be elected for the office of Implementation and Technical Assistance Committee Lead. Back to you, Commissioner Hedrick.
Thank you, Augustine, and thank you to the commissioners. I know that was a very honest conversation among us that happened really quickly. Appreciate your willingness to step forward, Commissioner Kim. As a next step in the process, as indicated, we'll bring the full recommendation. We'll bring this recommendation to the full commission. I think there was a plan for us to switch facilitation, but Commissioner Kim, if you'd like, I'm happy to continue to facilitate this meeting unless there's a stipulation that we must switch.
It would probably be in the best interest to switch because that's been given our process. So what we can do, we've kind of we're about 10 minutes early in terms of our recess and break. What we can do is recess for about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. And Commissioner Hedrick, I leave that decision up to you as to how long. But then we can make sure that Commissioner Kim on the back end has everything that they need to facilitate moving forward.
Yeah, I think an early break sounds great. I'll note that if folks are coming, if they're planning to join Dr. Estes, do we have to stay to the schedule per public guidance? Like, we'd have to wait till 5:20?
No, that's only for only our internal guidance in terms of timing things out. So we do not publicly post anything in terms of what time we will be taking a break on our public agendas, just because
Okay.
of things like this that happen.
Okay, so let's take a break till 5:10, and we'll resume at 5:10 to give the commissioners a moment to review and to take our normal recess.
Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you, Commissioner Hendricks. Okay, we're getting started back again at 5:10. It's 5:09. We'll give it another minute. All right, we'll now be calling the meeting back to order at 5:10. I want to thank the fellow commissioners for their vote of confidence as I take on this new role leading this particular committee. I'm actually going to go ahead and head back up on the agenda as we wanted to take some time to discuss the committee charge and to open up public comment for both our discussion on the charge as well as my selection as the committee lead. So today being the first meeting of the Implementation and Technical Assistance Committee, according to our bylaws amended on July 17th of this year, this committee is a standing committee under the California Racial Equity Commission. Its charge is to develop recommendations, including best practices and strategies for implementing the racial equity framework that's to be developed, and providing technical assistance to state agencies, local government entities, and others. This committee may present recommendations for action to the full commission at a regular meeting of the commission. So that is the current charge for this committee. We wanted to see if there were any discussion around among the committee members about our charge as outlined in our bylaws, and if there are any specific information you'd like to ask the staff to research for future meetings. So any discussion, comment on the charge, or further information you'd like the staff to dig up for us. Commissioner Under.
Hi, thanks, Commissioner Kim, and thank you for your leadership in this committee. I was thinking in terms of asking staff if there are any other examples that we might look to, whether it's in other states or possibly other state or local agencies that currently maybe possibly utilize something akin to a framework that we might look to or at least be able to discuss for some context as we work through developing our framework. That would be a suggestion I might add.
Other comments on the charter of the committee or things to ask the staff for more research on? I'm going to go ahead and sort of link up with Commissioner Onodera's request. I am hoping to see if we can dig up best practices and studies, actually specifically from California state government, and it does not have to be related specifically to racial equity, but where there have been other sort of enterprise-wide changes that were mandated and successfully implemented. In particular, what I'm looking for is looking at those case studies, what was the most efficient way to provide guidance and technical assistance to that department or to that enterprise to make the shift? How did departments track progress towards those goals in terms of the systems change? Who are the best leaders within systems to drive that change? And then finally, what kind of onboarding and training and how are staff leaders held accountable to the change? Again, does not have to be specifically around racial equity, but just to see how well state government has done this kind of systems change and what were some of the markers and lessons learned from that.
For clarification, you want it specific to California state government. Are you interested or open to other governmental bodies or jurisdictions?
I think Commissioner Onodera might have a separate answer. For myself, my particular comment was specifically for California state government, but I'll let Commissioner Onodera speak to her comment.
Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Kim. However, I think maybe at a higher level, if there are other examples, whether it's at local government or even other states where we have seen, I think positive either results and or just practices. I'd just be interested in those. Maybe not to the detailed degree that Commissioner Kim has mentioned for state agencies, because I do believe that will be very helpful, especially in the work that we're doing. But would be interested in other examples as well. To the degree, there's capacity, understanding. It's a lot already that's been asked for, so want to be sensitive to that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Hendrick?
Yeah, I just add to that, and not to be contrary, but I'd also be interested in knowing what didn't work. I know I can think of a few examples as it relates to maybe a tribal consultation or implementation of tribal liaisons. I'd be interested in seeing some case studies of strategies that were very well intended and had hoped to have potentially bigger impact than they did, so that we're aware of that at this committee as well. Most great ideas aren't new ideas, so I'm just also, excited to look at both what worked and what didn't work.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I do want to acknowledge that I'm actually present in St. Louis for the Race Forward conference, and did hear some great examples from other states about implementing things like trainings and how, what process that they went through with that. I believe there's other kind of opportunities there. So I just wanted to get some clarification, but definitely looking specific to California.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear, some of the comments I was making was to try to reach beyond, tracking numbers of trainings, but actual output in terms of systems change beyond the training itself. I would also add, given Commissioner Hendrick's point about what does or doesn't work, this is possibly something we lift back up as a question to the full commission, because it also then allows us to get public comment for people to lift up examples of what did or did not work for us to kind of dig into a little bit more.
We can definitely bring that as part of your committee report at the December 19th meeting, is potentially an opportunity for conversation there with the full commission, as well as in subsequent implementation and technical assistance committee meetings.
Excellent. I'm sure Dr. Abdul Rahman is going to have a lot of great stuff for us as well coming up. So before we get to him, let's go ahead, and not seeing any additional comments on this item from the commissioners. Augustine, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you for public comment on agenda item number 3, selection of committee lead and committee overview.
Thank you, Commissioner Kim. There are currently no public comments listed for this item.
All right. Let's go ahead and proceed. And I was not going to attend the meeting today because I'm taking a sick day, but I was very excited to see you all and to see Dr. Abdul Rahman speak. And so I'm very excited to have him join us. Let's go ahead and introduce him. Dr. Estes will be moderating a panel. It's actually less of a panel, more of a fireside chat. We're unfortunately not able to have another panelist, as Dr. Estes mentioned. Vivali Blossoming Bear was unable to join us, and so we'll be able to really focus in on our conversation with Dr. Rashad Abdul Rahman. And the opportunity here is to learn about actionable steps on implementing and applying racial equity tools, methodologies, and strategies. I'm assuming Dr. Abdul Rahman is going to basically give us all the answers in this fireside chat about how we're going to do what we're going to do. But for the conversation, let me go ahead and kick it over to Dr. Estes.
And thank you, Commissioner Kim. And that introduction was perfect. I mean, this is really about how we move beyond the theory of kind of the what and get to the how. And in looking at this committee and having it start meeting now as other committees are meeting, it helps us really create the intersection of what are the other committees doing and how does that connect into actually implementing and providing assistance to those that are looking for it. And so, the technical assistance side of things, it's really important because it provides resources, knowledge, and on how to lead effective interventions and understanding the best practices and the methods to support racial equity efforts really ground our commission in having a strong capacity and the staff to be responsive to the needs of those that we're serving and providing that assistance to. And so if we could get Dr. Abdur Rahman's image pinned up so folks can see him speaking, that would be great. Dr. Rashad Abdur Rahman is an anti-racism practitioner with a background in social work, behavioral health, child and family services, city and state government. He received his bachelor's degree in psychology from Berea College, his master's in science and social work from the University of Louisville, Kent School of Social Work, and his doctorate in social work at Spalding University with a special interest in exploring how organizations can better incorporate frameworks of belonging, humanization, and liberation. Dr. Abdur Rahman has worked in the field of child and family behavioral health services in various roles, including direct care counselor, therapist, clinical consultant, assessor, and program director. He has served as the director of the Office for Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods for the city of Louisville, Kentucky, working to operationalize a public health approach to violence prevention. Within state government, he has worked as an executive advisor for the Kentucky Cabinet for Health and Family Services to implement a racial equity strategy that included the adoption of a racial equity action plan for the first time in the state's history. Currently, he is the director of state strategies for Race Forward, working to support the expansion and sustainability of racial equity efforts in state government. In addition to these roles, he proudly serves as a board member for the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville, Kentucky. Dr. Abdul Rahman's personal mission statement is to work boldly and courageously to achieve racial and social justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Abdul Rahman.
Thank you for that very, very generous welcome. And it's good to join you, commissioners. Good to join you, Dr. Estes, for the call. And just shout out, I know it's a public meeting, like shout out to all the folks in California who are participating and engaged in the process. So much love and power to all of y'all.
Thank you. And we're going to jump right in here because I think the questions that we've created are going to generate a lot of conversation amongst the commissioners. And so when we talk about technical assistance, it's really different from forming kind of actionable strategies and executing deliverables. And in government structures, this work is often perceived as risky or difficult to do. So in the work that you've done and in your experiences, how do organizations address these concerns around the difficulty for implementation or the risk and really build that buy-in towards the implementation of racial equity strategies?
Yeah. Now, Commissioner Kim has set me up to have all the answers just across the board. But one of the things I appreciate you lifting up, Dr. S, is just like having the shared space with other state practitioners, particularly through Race Forward and the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, is that we do have space and we have a platform to where we do get to really hear and collect a lot of knowledge from practitioners who are moving racial equity strategies, certainly at the local level, but at the state level and otherwise. And so it was interesting in thinking about this question of difficulty. I don't know that any of the commissioners here are engaged because this endeavor appeared to be an easy or a simple task. And I know that community isn't holding folks accountable to this work because it's something that's easy. It requires that level of engagement, requires that level of accountability. So it certainly is difficult. And I think that it's important that although, particularly as you're thinking about southern states like Kentucky or Midwest states like Illinois or so on, which have this image of California as in many ways a Shangri-La where equity is just sort of growing on the trees. We know, certainly in conversation with folks that are doing the work, that California has its challenges as well. And so we know that it is difficult everywhere in this country. And we know that the reason why we are continuing to do this work with the veracity, with the commitment and the intentionality that we're doing it is because that's required. Now, part of what I hope that we'll talk about too, and I love the framing for this conversation, is the idea that theory to implementation also implies rigor. It implies process. It implies the way that we're being very serious, intentional, and deliberate about the way we do this work. And in fairness, I think one of the weaknesses of our work around equity, particularly within institutions, is that we haven't gone deep enough and we haven't been rigorous enough. And I think it's important that we can point to our own shortcomings across the board as it relates to the enormity of this challenge around racism and institutional racism and the way it plays out across systems and structures. The risk question, I think, is interesting because part of my premise around that is, have we calculated the risk of not doing this work?
Mhm.
Have we also framed up some analysis around the kind of risk we are assuming when we do not do work to address racial inequities, racial disparities, or the way institutions are producing racially disparate outcomes? Um, the type of harm and damage historically and in our contemporary environment as it relates to not doing this work, I think far outpaces any kind of analysis we can do around the kind of risk we assume when we do pursue efforts to implement racial equity strategies. That being said, certainly, yes, there's some level of risk that, which I think is connected to the difficulty of the work. But we can also be really deliberate about that. We can be deliberate about how we are naming and identifying the level of risk. For example, there's tools like risk registries or risk registers that we can utilize that allow us to identify and name the variety of risks that we may anticipate, however likely or unlikely. It's an opportunity to leverage our collective analysis to say, here's all the ways that we may face some risk or some challenges in doing the work. The beautiful thing about a risk register, in my mind, is that it also allows you to think proactively. If we understand that there might be legislative risks, for example, how are we thinking about the way to organize a narrative and organize a strategy that allows us to mitigate risk and, in fact, create a level of legislative strength for us to move our work forward? A good risk register allows you to neutralize or eliminate risk, and sometimes the reality is you may just be able to mitigate risk. But that level of intentionality and using some of those tools can be a helpful way to really pull out all of the ways that people might be thinking about risk and maybe haven't articulated it. But when you create that space of however likely, however unlikely, however fair, however unfair, here's the risk, I think you can solicit a lot of those potential weaknesses or threats that you might experience as you do your work, and then get into a proactive stance of how can we really be getting ahead and thinking down the line about ways to eliminate or mitigate some of those risks.
I love that idea of risk registries and particularly the drive of like naming a thing. I think we often roll around like, well, we can't do that because it's too risky, but don't want to actually name what we think the risk is and have that conversation behind, is it really risky? What is that risk? How do you mitigate, eliminate, or neutralize that risk? So thank you for bringing up that as a tool or a best practice.
Can I
And
also say real quick about risk is that city governments and state government structures do risk analysis all the time, all the time, whether it's capital strategies, whether it's programmatic strategies, investment strategies, whatever it might be. We are in the business of, in terms of government, government is in the business of risk analysis. So, and I think a theme in our conversation is we pretend sometimes that we don't know how to do this. but we do. But we just choose at times when to do it and when not to do it.
I love that because I think it's calling a spade and opening ourselves up to really understanding that there is power in the work that we are already doing and models that we already have to follow. And when we think about these best practices, such as a risk registry, what are some of the examples of implementation that you've seen that have been successful and what made them succeed?
Yeah. So there's a lot I think there's a lot to say about, and I really appreciate the conversation you all were having about identifying what works, identifying what hasn't worked. And I think when we're talking about that level and that scale of organizational change, organizational change management or institutional change, the level of nuance is is pretty significant. When you look at a lot of the research around organizational change, anywhere between 60% or 80% of organizations fail to actually succeed in their change management process. There are, of course, numerous reasons for that. In fact, you can have good strategy and fail. And a lot of that, to the point of this conversation, could have a lot to do with some of your implementation. But I think part of what's important is thinking about how are you navigating some of this sort of larger ideation around the work you want to do? And then, what we might call that implementation black box, how we get from this high level of ideation and value articulation to what it means on the ground. I think I heard one of the commissioners talking about some of those things in terms of goal setting, accountability measures, and so on. And there's ways to think about all that too. And so when I think about models, I think about institutions that or government agencies that are not perfect, but have been consistently committed to doing the work over time. And I'm always a little bit cautious around the sort of what works and what doesn't work, because I think we're really talking about who's invested and who hasn't invested. For me, that's probably a more useful conversation.
Mhm.
So you can think of and folks have probably had conversation about cities like Seattle, which in many ways not only created a blueprint for how local government creates racial and social justice initiatives, but then led in many ways to the birthing of the Government Alliance of Race and Equity through Julie Nelson and others who then took it to a more national framework. And then certainly there are states like Washington, certainly some of the colleagues you spoke with, Dr. Estes, like Washington, Illinois, who have these statewide equity offices that are thinking about some of these, some significant investments, both in very racial equitable ways, but also in terms of, legislation and institutional policy. And that are applying tools like social vulnerability indices that help really guide the kind of investments and work that state government agencies are doing. Also appreciate some of the earlier conversation you all had in terms of thinking about not only are the California agencies that might be demonstrating ways to implement institutional change strategies that are useful, but then also are the other states that are doing some things that are useful. And there certainly are. I was doing state government work in Kentucky before I came to Race Forward. And and as I say Kentucky, folks will be like, there's no way possible that Kentucky can be moving racial equity work forward. But what I'm here to tell you is that Kentucky's largest state agency, the Cabinet for Health and Family
Mhm.
Services, which is a $19 billion agency, some 8,000 employees, has presence and programs in all 120 counties across the state, has been implementing a racial equity strategy since 2020 and has been putting in place racial equity action plans for all of its departments, all of its agencies. Are some better than others? Of course. Are some further along than others? Of course. But what's really interesting is that there are lessons that can be learned from places like Kentucky, which are in ideally are in less permissive political environments, but have still found methods to implement strategy at cabinet and department levels and to articulate action plans with measures and accountability metrics, right, to actually do that work. And then have demonstrated some wins. In Kentucky, folks are doing legislative reviews using racial equity tools. Folks are implementing racial equity metrics into contracts, are doing direct funding to community-based organizations in racially equitable ways. So like a lot of these things are moving and happening in places. And I think, and realistically, considering the federal environment that we're heading into, how do we do work within more or less restrictive environments? I think there are state analogs that are useful to glean some learnings from and to figure out what are some of the pieces you can take and apply as well.
Mhm. I'm going to actually toss an audible here and ask you a little bit about some of the terminology that you're hearing in states like Kentucky, or other states where this work may be seen as less favorable. Are there specific languages or language that you're hearing being used that helps this work continue to move forward without losing the importance of centering race?
Hmm. So, one of the things that we saw in Kentucky was that the ability to connect some of the racial equity efforts with also addressing poverty and some of the class issues was a very useful method of helping folks make sense out of the work. Part of what we talked a lot about was that we have a lot of shared interests. There's an interesting movement in Kentucky called From the Hood to the Holler, which is really all about how do we connect some of these shared struggles in ways that are not normally connected. Now, that's not new. We certainly know that the Black Panthers were very committed to working across class, working across various cultures, right? And so, if the most radical Black Power organization that was working across class and culture, then who are we not to do that as well? But I think that speaks to the critical nature of thinking about our coalitions. Um, I think it's just very challenging to have a racial equity conversation that isn't intersectional, particularly when you're in a state like Kentucky. I think we all need to be really, really serious about intersectionality in these conversations without losing our focus on race and racial inequities. And then you have, some states that cannot say social emotional learning, right? And so there are some extreme measures that folks are going towards in terms of targeting language. But here's a piece that I'm chewing on. So one is that I don't know that there's safe ground to go to, meaning I don't know that there's some language that folks aren't going to come after. I think that I think there's a wide range of ways that folks can continue pursuing language. The other thing that's interesting to me is that even though folks are going after language, I'm not sure how much analysis folks have to go after strategy.
Mhm.
I don't know how much folks know in terms of being able to dismantle your strategy. I just don't know that I don't know that your opposition is that sophisticated yet. And so I'm just kind of thinking about those pieces that some of our battles are narrative battles, but then like how many of your battles, certainly, and of course there are states that are looking at legislation that's very targeted towards particular offices and titles and so on within universities, for example. But part of what I'm curious about is how much of it is an implementation question. How much are folks really saying, here are particular strategies and tactics that we have opposition to, or for whatever reasons. And that may even be an opportunity in terms of being able to justify the work that's happening. But I think those are useful things to be thinking about as we sort of ponder the way language is being weaponized against our work.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think the some of the bigger challenges is this idea of narrative. And part of this work is with the political noise that is going on around us, how do we continue moving that work forward? And you're hitting the nail on the head related to like what is our strategy and tactics in continuing this work despite kind of the political noise. Um, Something else that I think um, government often comes up across is this task of balancing conflicting priorities. Many states are not immune to budget challenges, staffing capacity. Um, what are some best practices or things that this commission should think about when it comes to those conflicting priorities of the need to advance racial equity and address structural racism, but also being mindful of budget and staffing capacity challenges that at every single level you see?
Right, right. Yeah. It's interesting. I think part of the work, certainly early on, is how do we help folks understand and how do we communicate well and effectively that this is not separate, that this work is not separate from the core functionality of government. So, for example, folks who are in child welfare or let's say public health spaces, your mission as a public health department is the public health and well-being if you're a statewide agency, for the state of California,
Mhm.
not for the state of some of California. So fundamentally, if you want to achieve your mission as a public health department, you just can't do it if you're leaving behind all kinds of folks who are experiencing systemic and structural oppression, marginalization, and so on, right? And so, how do we tether the work of racial equity and racial justice to the core functions of government is one piece that I think about. The other piece, and certainly Angela Glover Blackwell and certainly John Powell and the folks at the Othering Belonging Institute have been teaching us a lot about targeted universalism. And now, if you go around talking about targeted universalism, folks will nod politely, but will also not have a clue like what you're talking about. So, so part of it for us, I think, is how do we use plain language? How do we talk to folks about the fact that if we can solve problems where they are the greatest, all of us benefit. All of us benefit. So it is in all of our interest to solve the greatest problems and to be super focused on solving the greatest problems. Our ability to to both tether the work of racial equity to the work of government, but to tether those kinds of wins and progress and outcomes to what everyone is going to benefit from, I think is also a big piece of making sense of how we continue to prioritize the work. You could certainly talk about it from a sort of quality improvement, a performance improvement perspective. Oftentimes, when the work of government is progressing poorly, where we see that poor progress is where there's the greatest disparity. And so to the greatest increases are often at the intersection of where we see the greatest disparity. The greatest improvements are often at that intersection. So, we've got to sort of have a compelling narrative, a compelling argument for how this is not ancillary, but this is actually central to things that we're doing. And the reality is, if you have budget limitations, if you have staff capacity limitations, time limitations, then the the most productive thing you can do then is to think about racial equity. That's where you're going to maximize the time you have, maximize the resources you have available to you, produce the greatest outcome to the greatest number of people, is if you can orient your services and resources in such a way that they're producing more racially equitable outcomes. Where I live, a great example is that there's a part of town where I live where um, if you're able to elevate the median income of folks in one neighborhood in this city, you would increase the complete sort of like GDP for the cities substantially. You would increase life expectancy by like 250, like cumulatively, like 250,000 years, something like that. I mean, you get all of these boons, you get all of these like health and economic and social benefits from doing that. And so that is politically difficult because everyone wants to make their constituencies happy, of course. But I think also just from an executive branch element, as you're thinking about sort of what you've got and um, what you're moving forward, it makes a lot of sense to both strategically, morally, and in so many other ways. It just makes sense to bring racial equity analysis into the center of your work.
Mhm. Yeah, and speaking of racial equity analysis, measuring impact of these strategies is not easy. I think Commissioner Kim, you mentioned that is like, what is the accountability? How are we measuring impact? Um, Dr. Abdul Rahman, are you aware of any tools or strategies that we should be mindful of to ensure accountability for the racial equity commitments that this commission moves forward?
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. It seems to me that, setting goals, metrics, KPIs, that's actually not the hardest part. I do think that accountability ends up being a larger hurdle
Mhm.
for lots of reasons. And so, part of the negotiation is how do we ensure that we can get some agreement, some commitment, some courage, frankly, around what accountability looks like in the work. I think one of the beautiful things about these meetings being public, about having Californians involved in the process, is that you're being transparent. So that's a really critical component. I think that level of transparency has to extend to the accountability processes, and accountability does not mean that at the first sign of issue, people need to experience the harshest punishments or consequences possible. I don't think that's in line with our values of racial equity and social justice. But I do think it means that we've got to have difficult conversations, and I do think it means that we have to be clear about what we expect. Um, you know the Yeah, the question about like that connection between goals to accountability just has a lot to do with how we're being clear about that pathway,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of ways to do that. There's a lot of ways to think about where you are in the implementation process. Early on, it's typically wise to have metrics that are easy to understand, that are simple, understanding that later on, sophistication comes. But I just think it's important to have very early conversations about what accountability looks like,
Mhm.
what that process looks like, what's that cadence of accountability, and that it remains a transparent process.
Thank you for that. And transparency is very important when it comes to government. And this being a public advisory body, ensuring that we are bringing community into this space is critical to ensure that this work is successful. We're kind of up at our final question. I want to make sure that we give time for the commissioners to ask any questions or have discussion. Um, but what are some two, maybe three key takeaways or initial actions that practitioners can take to begin moving from theory to practice?
Yeah. So I often we get into a mindset that everything has to be fully baked before we start.
Mm-hmm.
That is not realistic, and it's counterthetical to the idea that, this is folks' lives, this is folks' livelihood. And we do need to have some level of urgency, not in a way that is toxic, but in a way that we are serious about the work is needed. There's lots of good material that helps us think about plan, do, study, act cycles that are, that can be really useful methods
Mhm.
of testing strategies, understanding sort of what some of the early efficacy is telling you, and then expanding and scaling work. There are ways to think about quick wins. What are some of the things on the perhaps short term that can be done, prioritized, and completed, both to build some momentum, but also so that you're not sort of stalling, trying to eat the elephant on day one.
Yeah.
There are a number of things that are important to do that can be done relatively quickly. And then just, going back to this idea of sophistication, I think that there is a temptation to have very detailed, very sophisticated, very nuanced sort of action plans and strategies out the gate that can then become a little unwieldy, on the front end. And, for my suggestion is, how do you think about something that is usable, that is going to be that's going to effectively articulate momentum against those quick wins with the expectation that over time, more and more sophistication is going to come, both because you're seeing success, you're experiencing momentum, but also because as you're making progress, you can take on bigger challenges, or you're situating and positioning yourself to engage more complex challenges as well. And of course that they may not always be realistic, right? There might be things that emerge that just have to be addressed quickly because that's what it is. Um, but I think just keeping in mind, right, that this level of this journey, this level of investment, this level of consistency, just positions you to, get more sophisticated and tackle more complex things over time. So, ah, uh, beware paralysis by analysis. Beware paralysis by analysis. I don't live in California, but I can guarantee you, you have a plethora of studies and research and documentation about racial inequities across the state. And so, the ability to get your head around some of that data and research certainly is important. I would just suggest that you all know, the community knows quite a bit, where those disparities are, and how folks are experiencing those disparities in their daily lives. And so, sometimes I will see goals on an action plan that, we're going to take 2 years to collect a certain data point. And I just don't know that folks have that kind of time, right? I don't know that folks have that kind of time, and I don't know that that should preclude us from doing some work. So I would say, prioritize action, prioritize movement, even if it's a plan, do, study cycle, just getting some work moving, with the understanding that we're always going to be learning, we're always going to be responding to new data, we're always going to be engaging in ways that are both, participatory, where folks in community that are living out these barriers every day are going to have ways to leverage that lived knowledge along with reports and data, whatever else you're utilizing. And that there's no perfection out here, right? There's no such thing as perfection, but there is the commitment to continued growth and improvement.
Wow, that's a great way to end this conversation. Please join me in thanking our speaker, Dr. Abdul Rahman, for providing this informative discussion and getting this committee really jump started on its conversation around implementation and technical assistance. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Commissioner Kim to facilitate discussion, reflections, as well as ask questions of our speaker.
Oh, excellent. I wanted to clarify that we could ask questions for Dr. Abdul Rahman. So thank you again for sharing your wisdom. I wanted to open up to the committee and other commissioners if there are any questions or discussion on what we've heard today. Commissioner Salas.
Thank you so much, Doctor. It was just wonderful to hear your presentation. I'm very curious also if you have examples when you talk about, sometimes being very risk averse, instead just putting them forward, of entities that actually confronted a particular, actually noted the risk came forward and how they actually handled, maybe some of the pushback, any examples that could be helpful. As when we think about implementation, and we think about, sometimes the other part is that you implement, you get some pushback, and then you stop implementing. So just any additional insight that you can provide for us, that would be very helpful. Also considering sort of the context in which this work is going to get done.
I will remind everyone that we are now in the lightning round portion of the game. So if Dr. Abdul Rahman could, we're going to go through probably a few of these questions.
Sure. So unfortunately, I don't know too many examples of state agencies for this work using risk registers early on in the process. I do know that certainly at the local government level, there are often offices, maybe not often, but there are sometimes offices of performance improvement that do some of that risk analysis for agencies that are preparing to engage in some of the work. Health departments have been known to use fishbone diagrams or 5 why analysis in thinking through some of the projects that they're working on. Now, that's not a great analog for a risk register, but it is, I think, a good analog for some of that sort of early thinking processes that can be really useful. The GARE, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, offers a racial equity tool that does ask questions about certainly has there been, conversation and partnership with community in thinking about unintended consequences and thinking about particular projects or proposals that folks are moving forward, which I think does get at some of that risk analysis. The other thing I would offer is that it could also be useful to think about nonprofits or other sectors that have engaged in this kind of racial equity work, anti-white supremacist work, anti-racist work, and have offered case studies. And in many of those case studies, or at least some of them, folks do talk a little bit about some of the anticipated challenges and risks and how they thought about navigating and managing some of those. Now, that's going to be different for everybody, but I think it's just useful to perhaps to think about how folks have considered potential risks as they were engaging in this work, and then ways they may have adjusted some of their efforts to accommodate.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Any other questions for the good doctor or discussion items? Let me ask, Doctor, we're thinking about the risk registers, and you make the point that risk assessment and mitigation is part and parcel of government's job on a host of things. I would imagine risk analysis and mitigation for something like this is relatively unique. It's different than the kind of skill set and capacities for like a capital program or project or what have you. Have you seen places where they've built out and what kind of skill sets are required to really kind of, is it being able to protect against frivolous litigation? Like what are the kinds of skill sets, capacities to really be able to not only assess risk, but actually to overcome them? Just trying to dig in a little bit more of where Commissioner Salas was taking us.
Yeah. So, and please, let me know if I'm missing your question. In terms of some of the skill sets where some of this kind of analysis can be really useful. Folks who are doing some of your performance improvement work. So, I imagine this is like your Six Sigma black belts and like all of that kind of, all of those sort of, what do you call them? Project management professionals, the PMPs, have a lot of a significant amount of depth in thinking about risk analysis. I also wouldn't count out your health equity folks who are often doing a lot of risk analysis around community risk factors, social determinants of health, and so on. There's
Mhm.
in some ways we are innovating, sort of new government skill sets to do the kind of work that we're describing. But I think those are two rounds where you'll find some really good examples of the kind of skills that could be really useful in doing that kind of analysis. I wouldn't count out, of course, some of the legal questions. I'm just always mindful that legal folks are very risk adverse, and
Yep.
the risk, the safety view there is don't do anything, and I don't think
Right.
that's
Right.
what we're trying to do here.
Good. That's exactly why I asked that question. I appreciate that. Other comments, I'm noting that we still need to discuss what we want to kind of, if there's any discussion beyond questions for the doctor. I don't know, Dr. Estes, if what it looks like in terms of time and how we want to close out. But I want to see if
Um,
there's any discussion from the commissioners as well.
yeah, we're still open to having discussion and then moving to public comment and then our final agenda item around action steps. So feel free to continue the discussion should there be any.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to prompt the committee to think about, from what we've heard today, what would be most important to lift back up to the full commission? What are some key points we want to make sure to lift back up to the full commission? Because they're going to quiz us on what we did with this time. Yes.
Would just say based on, what we've heard today, it does sound like there is a lot of this work that is currently being done, and that there are some examples out there, and I think would be important for us as a commission to hear what some of those examples are, and be able to lift those up, both best practices as well as what Commissioner Hedrick had mentioned, those things that have been tried that maybe haven't been successful. Um, so that makes me hopeful, actually.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mhm.
Commissioner Salas.
Yes, one thing that that really prompted me from this, and that I think we could take back to the full commission, is this idea of implementing, like an implementation chart, which is what are some things we can get done very quickly. And it will stay with me when you said, sometimes we want to eat the entire elephant all at the same time, but just to really kind of put through, like, these are things that we can do immediately. These are things that might take a little longer, but do those things. Do the things that are sometimes simpler and also, but will provide that impact that we need. So I think we can think about in the implementation part of our work about really breaking down all the things that need to get done so we can do the most as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and this point about growing sophistication over time, I thought was very good as well. Commissioner Hendrick, anything from you?
Just thank you for the presentation. I think you've given us a lot to think about. I have a lot of questions that we don't have time for,
Yeah.
like some of the specific examples of implementation. And so that's homework for me. So just I thank you for giving that to us and giving us an opportunity to really like chew on some of this.
Yeah, I think for myself, the biggest challenge, I appreciate the quick wins and starting with action as opposed to starting with more questions. My worry is that oftentimes, we launch to go for the low hanging fruit. And, I'm not a tall guy, so I like low hanging fruit. But in California, some places that part of the tree has been picked, right? Like, how do we start to think about the more structural, the more at scale, the more bigger shifts that we need to think about, and not some of the stuff that's just sort of right in front of us? So how to take the idea of action and quick action, but scale is the balance point that I'm really trying to hold. All right, I think we are all set unless commissioners, any other comments or questions? I know it's getting late, so I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to commission staff to let us know about if there are any public comments.
Thank you, Commissioner Kim. There are currently no public comments listed for this item.
All right. Okay, so I think with that, we want to thank Dr. Rashad Abdul Rahman for joining us today. A wealth of knowledge. Wish we had another few hours with you, and we might want to find out how we could follow up with you for some of these specifics down the road. Want to thank Dr. Estes and the staff for moving us to this point. I wanted to kick it over to you, Dr. Estes, about action items to close us out.
Thank you, Commissioner Kim. Looks like there is one comment that just popped up, so I do want to yield my time back to Augustine to see if we need to pull that person if it's for the previous item.
Augustine?
Yes, it's going to be for this current item. Elena, you may go ahead and do your public comment as soon as you're unmuted. Elena, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And Elena Santamaria, Senior Policy Advisor at NextGen California. And thank you so much to the commission staff, Dr. Estes, for this really robust discussion. I think what prompted me to speak during public comment in terms of lessons learned in California when the executive order on equity was first put out in the fall of 2022, in that was a charge for state departments to embed equity into their strategic plans from 2023 to 2026. I think we as advocates have followed up here and there within our respective issue areas. And I think that's a good case study to look of lessons learned of implementation or consideration for the commission to look at. And so I just wanted to uplift that of perhaps things that worked well, things that didn't work well. I think that is a very clear example of a goal that was intended when the EO on equity was put out, and then where is the state at in that work. So I just wanted to uplift that example for the commission and if for consideration to take a look at. So really appreciate the time, everyone's effort on all of this work. I think in terms of what to look forward and what can be implementable in the framework, because at the end of the day, we all just want to see this work, the framework work, and the work sustained. So really appreciate the time and appreciate all the robust discussion that's been happening here today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think, is that the last public comment?
Yes,
So.
Commissioner Kim,
I will,
includes
I
public.
will, thank you so much. Given that, I do want us to consider for the next committee meeting, for us to potentially follow up and get some sense of tracking down that particular example of when the executive order was passed and what actions were taken, because we did talk about it seems extremely relevant to the work that we're doing, and we are talking about the need to really learn from past examples, and for us to consider what are the ways to measure what we're doing here, and what we can get done. So I would ask the staff to do some follow-up on that one. With that being said, do we move towards action items or do we move towards closing out, Dr. Estes?
I can quickly go over the action items that I've heard today. The first one being Commissioner Kim bringing your selection as the committee lead to the full commission, providing a committee report at that full commission meeting so the other commissioners not in attendance can be made aware of the dialogue and some of the questions and potential action items that came out of this meeting. A couple other items that came up in conversation, identifying examples of implementation of frameworks, specific practices within California state government, and Commissioner Kim, that goes to your desire to kind of understand where the state may have been in some of its implementation related to the executive order. How are we tracking progress? What are the skills and capacities that leaders need to have to drive change, accountability and outcomes with systems change, onboarding and training, what worked, what didn't work, and also bringing this to the full commission to have some conversation behind, as they may also have some insight on that. I heard the interest in having further conversations with Dr. Abdul Rahman, so that's something that we can also explore, and even looking at future meetings, not only looking at some of the actions taken with the executive order, but where some of the best practices and examples of where we're seeing this work being implemented and technical assistance provided across the country, but specifically trying to find some examples within California.
Excellent. So thanks again to the commission staff, to to Dr. Abdul Rahman for the commissioners and the public for joining us today. This brings us to meeting adjournment. I wanted to see if we can adjourn by common consent. And seeing some nods. Thank you again for everyone who's joined us today. The commission will convene again for our Community Engagement Committee meeting, followed by the full commission meeting on December 19th, 2024 in Sacramento, California. And with that, we are adjourned at 6:09 p.m.